Have you ever felt that strange sensation when you realize you've gone further than everyone around you? When you look back and see that no one else is running in your direction anymore? When you discover that the journey you thought was a collective race has become a solitary walk into unknown territory? It's a feeling that's both liberating and terrifying, as if you've crossed an invisible door into a place where the old rules no longer apply, where conversations that once made sense now sound empty, where the problems that consumed your friends seem distant and irrelevant. Today we're going to explore this experience through the eyes of Albert Camus, the philosopher who best understood what it means to be alone at the top of the mountain of consciousness, discovering that the view up there is both magnificent and desolate. Camus knew that there comes a moment in certain people's lives when they wake up from a collective sleep and realize they're operating on a different frequency from the rest of humanity. It's not arrogance, it's not superiority, it's simply such a radical shift in perspective that makes it impossible to return to where they were before. It's as if you had learned a new language and discovered that very few people can understand it. You try to explain your discoveries, your reflections, your insights, but the words seem to fall on deaf ears, or worse yet, are interpreted as pretentiousness or unnecessary melancholy. Imagine a person who spent years questioning everything around them, deconstructing beliefs, analyzing social patterns, confronting their own illusions, and suddenly realizes they're in a completely different mental place from where they started. Friends still complain about the same old problems, still worry about the same trivialities, still believe in the same comforting narratives about the meaning of life, while this person has developed a clearer, rawer, more honest view of the human condition. It's not that they became better than others, it's that they went through an awakening process that few are willing to face. This surpassing of everyone isn't a matter of superior intelligence or exceptional ability. It's a matter of courage to look directly at aspects of existence that most people prefer to avoid. Camus called this confronting the absurd of life, that fundamental contradiction between our human need to find meaning and the apparent indifference of the universe in providing us with that meaning clearly and definitively. When you truly absorb this reality, when you stop fighting against it and begin to accept it, you move into existential territory that few can inhabit comfortably. The loneliness that emerges from this understanding is different from ordinary loneliness. It's not just being physically alone or temporarily isolated. It's the loneliness of someone who sees the world through lenses that few possess. It's like being the only adult in a room full of children, or the only sober person at a party where everyone is intoxicated by consoling illusions. You still feel affection for these people, you can still interact with them, but there's a fundamental distance between your experience of reality and theirs. This distance manifests in subtle and profound ways. Conversations that were once stimulating now seem superficial. Problems that once seemed urgent now reveal their transitory and often self-implemented nature. Successes that once brought lasting satisfaction are now recognized as temporary moments of pleasure in an existence that offers no permanent guarantees of happiness or fulfillment. You haven't become pessimistic, you've become realistic in a way that few can bear. Camus understood that this journey beyond collective illusions is simultaneously a liberation and a burden. On one hand, you gain incredible clarity about your own motivations, about the social dynamics around you, about the temporary nature of all human things. You stop wasting energy on unnecessary dramas, stop seeking validation in places where it could never be found authentically, stop believing in promises of permanent happiness that the world simply cannot fulfill. On the other hand, this clarity comes with the weight of total responsibility for your own existence. When you can no longer blame circumstances, other people, fate, or external forces for your dissatisfaction, when you recognize that you're fundamentally alone in the task of creating meaning for your life, the weight of this freedom can be overwhelming. There's no longer any external authority to tell you what to do, no pre-existing belief system that can resolve your existential dilemmas, no community that shares exactly your perspective on life. But Camus didn't see this condition as a tragedy. He saw it as an opportunity. When you stop expecting the world to provide you with meaning and start creating your own meaning, when you stop seeking company at the level of shared illusions and start valuing more authentic and rare connections, when you stop trying to fit into molds that were never made for you and start living according to your own truth, something extraordinary happens. You discover a form of freedom that few experience, an authenticity that transcends the need for external approval, a peace that doesn't depend on favorable circumstances. This discovery doesn't eliminate loneliness, but transforms its nature. Instead of being a loneliness of rejection or inadequacy, it becomes a loneliness of conscious choice. You understand that certain conversations, certain activities, certain concerns simply no longer resonate with who you've become. And that's perfectly fine. You don't need to force connections that are no longer genuine, don't need to pretend interest in things you don't consider important, don't need to apologize for having evolved beyond where you were before. At the same time, this conscious loneliness opens space for deeper and more meaningful connections. When you stop wasting energy trying to relate on superficial levels, when you stop accepting crumbs of understanding, you create space for real encounters with people who have also made their own journey of awakening. These connections may be rare, but they have a quality and intensity that compensate for their scarcity. It's the difference between having 100 acquaintances and having one true friend. Camus also recognized that surpassing everyone doesn't mean becoming indifferent to human suffering. On the contrary, it often means developing a deeper and less sentimental compassion for the struggles we all face. When you truly understand the absurd condition of human existence, when you recognize that we're all fundamentally alone in our most essential experiences, you develop an empathy that transcends superficial moral judgments. You begin to see that people who are still trapped in patterns you've overcome aren't necessarily being lazy or ignorant. They're simply at different points in their existential journeys. Some may never make the transition you made, and that doesn't make them inferior, just different. Some may be preparing for this transition without knowing it, and your conscious presence can be a silent example that it's possible to live differently. This understanding brings an interesting responsibility. When you surpass conventional patterns of thought and behavior, you become, in a way, a pioneer in unexplored existential territory. Your choices, your way of dealing with anxiety and uncertainty, your ability to create meaning without depending on external structures, all of this becomes a kind of living experiment about the possibilities of human existence. You discover that you don't need to evangelize or try to convince others to follow your path. In fact, trying to do so is usually counterproductive and reveals a residual insecurity about your own choices. The most powerful way to influence is simply to live authentically, to demonstrate through your actions that it's possible to be happy, productive, and connected, even without depending on the psychological crutches that most people consider essential. But let me ask you a question that goes straight to the heart of this experience. Have you ever felt alone even when surrounded by people, as if you were speaking a language that no one else completely understands? If you recognize this feeling, write in the comments, "I feel this too." Your response not only helps other people feel less alone in this journey, but creates a small community of people who understand that surpassing everyone can be both liberating and isolating. You're not alone in this, even when you feel that way. The experience of being ahead of everyone in the journey of self-knowledge and existential awakening also reveals something fundamental about the nature of human progress. We discover that there's no universal finish line, no point where everyone will eventually meet. Each person has their own speed, their own capacity to absorb uncomfortable truths, their own willingness to abandon familiar securities in exchange for authenticity. This means that those who surpass conventional patterns may find themselves permanently ahead, permanently alone in certain understandings. Camus saw this condition not as a curse, but as a special vocation. Those who can comfortably inhabit the more advanced territories of human consciousness serve as scouts for the species, exploring existential possibilities that may eventually become more accessible to others. It's a role that requires courage, emotional resistance, and a particular form of altruism that doesn't expect immediate recognition or widespread understanding. This perspective completely transforms the experience of existential loneliness. Instead of being a sign that something is wrong, it becomes an indicator that something is very right. Instead of being a problem to be solved, it becomes a condition to be embraced and used creatively. The loneliness of the existential pioneer isn't empty. It's full of possibilities, full of discoveries, full of opportunities to create entirely new ways of living and relating to reality. When you understand this, when you truly absorb the idea that your loneliness is a product of your growth and not your inadequacy, a profound transformation happens. You stop trying to go back to where you were before. Stop trying to fit into conversations and concerns that no longer make sense to you. Stop feeling guilty for having evolved beyond certain limitations that still affect people around you. This acceptance liberates incredible energy that was previously being wasted in frustrating attempts to reconnect with old versions of yourself and with people who can no longer relate to who you've become. This energy can be redirected toward creative exploration, toward the development of new insights, toward the creation of works or projects that express your unique perspective on existence. Camus always emphasized that the absurd of life shouldn't lead to despair, but to creative revolt. When we apply this to the experience of surpassing everyone and discovering that there's no one there, we realize that this discovery should lead us not to bitter isolation, but to the creation of new forms of connection and meaning. If there's no one at your level of understanding, perhaps your function is to create bridges, create art, create ideas that make this level more accessible to others. This doesn't mean simplifying your discoveries or diminishing their complexity to make them more palatable. It means finding languages, metaphors, examples that can communicate the essence of your understandings without betraying them. It means accepting that it may be your role to be a kind of translator between different levels of consciousness, helping people take the next steps in their own journeys without trying to drag them to where they're not yet ready to go. This is one of the most interesting discoveries of those who surpass conventional patterns. You realize that your loneliness can be transformed into a specialized form of service. It's not the obvious service of solving practical problems or offering emotional comfort. It's the more subtle service of demonstrating that there are other ways to live, other ways to think, other ways to relate to the inevitabilities of human existence. But this service can only be offered from a place of genuine acceptance of your own condition. If you're still fighting against your existential loneliness, if you're still trying to force connections that are no longer possible, if you're still feeling victimized by having grown beyond where others can reach, you don't have energy available to contribute creatively to the world. All your energy is being consumed by internal resistance. Acceptance doesn't mean passive resignation. It means active recognition of the realities of your situation and willingness to work creatively within those realities. It means understanding that some forms of loneliness are signs of psychological health, not pathology. It means valuing the quality of your connections more than the quantity, the authenticity of your experiences more than their popularity. When you reach this point of mature acceptance, something magical happens. Loneliness stops being an emotional problem and becomes a creative resource. The silence around you stops being a frightening void and becomes a fertile space for reflection and creation. The absence of external voices telling you what to do stops being disorienting and becomes liberating. If you've made it this far in this reflection, if these words are resonating with something deep in your experience, maybe it's time to consider subscribing to this channel. Not as just another passive consumption of content, but as part of a small but meaningful community of people who understand that growing sometimes means leaving certain things and people behind, that evolving sometimes means accepting forms of loneliness that others can't comprehend. Here you find reflections that honor the complexity of human experience, that don't promise easy solutions, but offer intelligent company on the journey of becoming who you really are. What Camus finally teaches us about surpassing everyone and discovering that there's no one there is that this discovery marks not the end of our human journey, but the beginning of a completely new and more interesting phase. It's when we stop defining our progress in relation to others and start defining it in relation to our own unrealized potential. It's when we stop seeking external validation for our discoveries and start trusting our own capacity for discernment. This transition requires a mature form of courage that goes beyond the heroic courage of adventure tales. It's the quiet courage of living according to your own discoveries, even when no one else understands or approves. It's the courage to create meaning from emptiness, to find beauty in uncertainty, to maintain compassion even when you can no longer share the illusions that give comfort to other people. Camus shows us that true revolution doesn't happen when crowds move together toward a common goal, but when courageous individuals decide to stop following crowds and start exploring unexplored territories of human consciousness. These individuals inevitably find themselves alone, but their loneliness has a different quality from the loneliness of those who have been abandoned or rejected. It's the loneliness of those who chose a more difficult path because they discovered that easy paths don't lead anywhere interesting. When you understand this completely, when you absorb not just intellectually but emotionally the reality that surpassing everyone means accepting a specific form of existential loneliness, you discover a peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. You stop expecting the world to become different so you can be happy. You stop expecting other people to evolve at your pace so you can feel connected. You accept total responsibility for creating a life that makes sense to you, regardless of what others think or do. This acceptance isn't cold or indifferent. It's full of a peculiar compassion that can only be developed by those who understand deeply both the possibilities and limitations of the human condition. You develop love for people exactly as they are, not as you wish they were. You develop gratitude for your own journey, including your loneliness, because you understand that it's the price and reward of having had the courage to grow beyond conventional limitations. In the end, discovering that there's no one there when you surpass everyone is discovering that there was never anyone there, that we've always been fundamentally alone in our most essential experiences. That genuine connection can only happen when we stop pretending we're not alone and start connecting from that fundamental loneliness. It's discovering that loneliness, well understood and well embraced, doesn't separate us from others, but makes us capable of forms of intimacy and understanding that simply aren't possible when we're trying to escape from our own company.